Hey, what's up? This is the Flyover Libertarian podcast, where two unimportant people from an unimportant place give you the opinion that you didn't ask for. I'm Iowancap.
And I'm the Rural Rothbard. Today we're talking about decentralization.
And of course, we should introduce our guest. We're joined by our friend Deribley from deep within the dark web.
It's nice to be back. Thanks for having me, guys.
Or as you called it, Deribelli. We've been pronouncing it completely different this whole time.
That's cool. I avoid pronouncing it just so that there's that confusion.
Hey Dirigible, how you doing?
I am full of hot air.
I wanted to talk about decentralization as a design pattern because with Deribelli's conversation last time, we could see reasons why it's so useful in money and economics. And we also just see that outside of money, we see it in economics because it responds to consumer preferences way better than a centralized, coordinated effort ever could. The thought that kicked this off was Joel Salatin he's a farmer essentially, and he went on the Joe Rogan podcast again a couple weeks ago, and the reason they had him on was to talk about the food system, and his complaint is that the food system has become highly centralized and it's become very dependent on just a few processors that now we're seeing when those processors can't operate. Even if there's supply and there's demand, we can't get our product through, and they've been having to kill hogs in the industry. And so that got me thinking, his vision for that industry is very decentralized. He wants chickens and eggs in every neighborhood. And one stat he had actually was that if 1 in 3 households in the U.S. had chickens in their backyard, we could actually put the egg industry out of business. There wouldn't need to be an extra egg industry if 1 out of 3 households had. That's not necessarily his goal, but that's to illustrate a point that when you decentralize an industry, it's possible to decentralize an industry that much. It has other environmental benefits that if you're interested in that, definitely go listen to his interview there, where he can list off all these things about the interconnected system that decentralized nature of an egg industry would bring about just through the way it's designed. And I know that that's true for a lot of things in life. So does anything similar come to mind?
For me, the first thing I think of is the irony of talking about something being designed and also being decentralized. Like, properly done, a decentralized system can't be designed at all. I mean, it has to come out, has to grow naturally, with nobody in charge, with no centralized input, which I think is why humans are so bad at it.
Yeah.
Because we like to be in charge of things. We legitimately think that our view of the world is the right one. I think that I know good and evil, and therefore the world needs to hear my opinion on good and evil. Which, when you get into the meme world, that is actually what brings about the Karens, where there is somebody out there who sees something happening and has decided that it is unacceptable, and it is therefore so unacceptable that they feel it is their duty to report it to whatever the authorities are, so that the bad thing that they have deemed bad ends, and the good thing that they've decided is good can continue. And humans are just fantastically terrible at letting somebody else live their own life.
I think it's interesting that you're getting into that, and or it's interesting that what you're getting at is kind of like a it's really at the heart of both leftist and again, I mean in the big government leftist, and also in the neoconservative pushes this idea that what's right here must be right somewhere else. and it's not okay to, like, live and let live is never okay, right? It's if things aren't exactly the way we think it should be, we're going to make it that way. And I think it's somewhat ironic for us as like, we're all here Christians to be talking about, like, we know what good and evil is, and yet we're also like, and so I'm sure someone who's been following our page or our podcast would say, wait, aren't you guys being a little bit hypocritical? And I think maybe there's something to that of, like, there is a tendency, I think, especially among Christians, to then baptize these preferences to say, either on the, like, you could call it the pro-Western civilization right, or the social justice left, to be like, these preferences or this vision of the way I think the world should work, we're going to baptize this and call it a Christian virtue. When the fact is, there is a lot of like gray area, like, about, okay, so, like, I once was talking to a pastor about evangelism, and we had just been in a conversation where he led with a certain opening line that for him was still a lead in to presenting the gospel. And afterwards he asked me, so, like, what were you thinking about that? And I said, well, I don't know if I would have led with that opening line. And really all I was thinking was, like, that's just not the way I would do it. It probably, with the way I talk and the way I think, it probably wouldn't have sounded right coming from me. And immediately he kind of went on the defensive, like, so what? You think you have a better way? Like, I don't know. This is just a preference thing, man. The whole point is there's different ways to get at the same thing. And it's going to work differently for one person than for another. Now just expand that to community level. And that's kind of how decentralization works. There's things that are going to work in one community that are not going to work in another. Again, I'm going right back to my wheelhouse of the church, but there's some things that I've made work at one church that flop in another, right? And it's not because it was a good or a bad idea, or because the people here are stupid, but they got it over there. It's because certain things will work in certain communities, with certain personalities, certain people involved, that are not going to work in other areas. Which is why the United States of America is such a stupid idea. Like, it's just a stupid idea. Like, one law of the land to cover the entire, like, this massive continent. That's so dumb. It just does not make sense. With all these people with different situations and different thoughts and views, it's just, I don't know. I just don't know that it works.
No, pessimistically speaking, the United States of America can't work, not because, it was poorly set up, not because it's improperly implemented. It can't work because there are humans involved. It will, unless Jesus comes back first, the United States is going to end someday. Hopefully it'll be peaceable. Hopefully hopefully the secession movement will happen, and things will just. But on the other hand, the last couple days have shown us that this could end really very violently. People will die.
Going back to the church, then, Josh, is I think one criticism people have of the church is that it's so decentralized and so many different denominations. In a way, that could be considered a feature and not a bug. Do you see that as a feature and not a bug? I mean, if we're all humans aren't perfect. Is it better to have a decentralized denominational system than one single capital C church that hands down?
Well, I mean, this is where I can only speak from my perspective. I'm a Baptist, and so yeah, I actually do think it's a feature, not a bug. I think because this is at the heart of the Baptist ecclesiology is that the church exists on the local level. Like, that's where the church exists. We believe that an individual church, this is why in Baptist churches, It is the local church that ordains a pastor, not the denomination. So I was ordained by a local church in South Dakota where I was serving. That's where I was ordained. And that ordination, other churches kind of look at that and they'll acknowledge that ordination, but I was ordained by that church. We went through a denomination, or not a denomination, even technically that's not correct. Baptists are not denominational, they're associational.
Voluntary.
Yeah, exactly. We went through an association and we got feedback from them. Like I went before a ordination recommendation committee. They're a recommendation committee. Their job was to recommend me or not. But in the end, the local church could do whatever they want. Now, because
whoa! I don't understand. If you don't have a central authority making you get along, how are you just not like constantly fighting wars with each other?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Because I've never heard of a situation where the recommendation committee comes back and says we don't recommend this person for ordination, and the church said, "Well, screw you, we're doing it anyway." You know, some local churches don't have an association and will just ordain or not ordain whoever they want, but usually. Most people, at least most serious people, know to steer clear of those churches. But yeah, isn't that remarkable? Like there is no governing bylaw saying that we had to take this recommendation committee. And in fact, this recommendation committee did actually come back to me and say, well, first we need you to rewrite your denominational statement. Like there's places where they wanted me to rewrite it. And I could have at that point been like, no, you know, but I did. I took their recommendation. We went back. We rewrote it, and ultimately they did obviously recommend me, and I was ordained. And yeah, and it's interesting because it's like you say, a lot of times when we talk about this voluntary society, we'll talk about things like regulatory bodies that will rise up that will be non-governmental, and yet people will still listen to them. Well, it's because people don't want to die. And so they're going to look for regulating agencies who they trust. Like this is a good agency. They do the science, they do the math, they look at the stats, and they tell you whether or not a drug is safe. And you know,
but
I like this agency, so I go to them.
And if the agency is wrong, then the people who are supporting that agency, who are interacting with that agency, will over time say, wait a minute, no, I'm going to go to this other agency. I'm going to go to this other agency. Opposed to what happens right now where the governmental agency that exists, when it goes wrong, they just throw more money at it. And they make it worse. Whereas if you can just slowly, dry it out one by one, people leaving the ship, then there is that built-in, I guess, incentive structure where the agency is in charge of creating those regulations, but they're completely unenforceable unless the people agree to abide by them. So the agency is creating regulations that work the best for the industry, while also advocating for whatever they are, proper theology or safety or efficiency or whatever they exist for.
And it's interesting that there are certain, there's a lot of like knee slap or knee jerk Catholics who will be like, the Reformation is the worst thing to happen to Christendom. But honestly, there are some, I guess you could call them like some more honest Catholic historians who would say, and you know what? The result of the Reformation is the Catholic Church, which had gotten pretty lax, had to get its act together. Like, so there's a very concrete example of where competition benefited both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ultimately, I don't think that they reformed rightly, otherwise I would join them, but that's part of association of decentralizations. I chose a different side than them. I don't think that they're right. And so I chose a different side. I chose the Baptist side. And I also could have joined the Presbyterian side, but instead I joined the Baptist side. Like, there are lots of options, and that does sharpen. It's that old proverb, right? Iron sharpens iron. There are, when there's a multiple denominations debating which is getting Christianity right, it does sharpen one another, and honestly, it keeps one another honest, because I think it's funny whenever anyone throws out the whole Protestants have so many thousands of different denominations. It's overstating the difference. A lot of times the difference is on side issues. Like if when I'm messaging my Lutheran pastor friend or my Reformed pastor friend or my Presbyterian friend, when we get down to like the question, okay, so how does a person get saved? We're all on the right. We're all on the same page. We're not arguing over the center. There's these side issues that we think each other is wrong about, you know. And I yeah. But
So
yeah.
I just came up with like a slightly heretical example of that. Where
watch it, I might call your pastor.
No, that's I got his number. It's kind of like all the bars downtown where like they all have their own clientele. There's the upscale ones, there's the wine bars, there's the places that serves the rednecks. But at their core, they serve beer, a good time, and maybe some really terrible food. And that's what they do. And my understanding of the Christian church as a whole is, yeah, we can argue forever about whether or not you're supposed to stand up when the scripture is read. But none of that is a salvation issue. None of that matters in the context of eternity. And we're not usually serving beer, but we're all focused on the core things that we actually care about.
Yeah, and I think there's something to that of like also, just because we're saying, to bring it back to the first topic, just because we're saying we'll decentralize everything doesn't mean everything is going to look completely different. Like I think that's some of the worry sometimes is like we're saying we're going to decentralize into lots of little communities and they're all going to put walls and no one's going to be able to pass between city to city. Suddenly you're stuck in your own little territory. I mean, like Germany before it was a unified nation was lots of little communities and little sub-regions that all had their own local customs and local identities, and yet they were German. They were all still German, and they had things in common that they would pass between the cities, and yeah, they would look different. They would have different food, probably would wear different clothes, but there was enough commonalities that there would still be commerce. And ultimately, I think that is really what will hold together a decentralized world is commerce. Like the fact that they have to do business with someone else. Like if you want oranges, you got to do business with Florida. Just gotta.
No, like the commerce thing is interesting because really in order to have some sort of commerce, you have to have three things in my wise understanding of commerce. You have to have a way to transact. Either it's barter or you have to have some form of money. You have to have some way to communicate, be that a language or just numbers written on a piece of paper. You have to be able to communicate. Some modicum of trust. You have to be able to trust the other person. You don't have to trust them for a second longer than the transaction, but you have to be able to trust the person to some extent. And your trust might go as far as the fact that you're packing heat, and if anything goes wrong, at least you'll get out. But there has to be some way. The language, the form of currency or barter, and the trust, they can kind of interchange. Whereas if you share a common language, it's easy to establish trust. Whereas if you don't share a common language, it's less easy to establish trust. However, if you don't speak the same language, but you both highly value a certain currency, it's easy to establish trust through that currency. And it just seems to be that commerce in general, I guess my entire point is that commerce in general requires those three, but not in equal amounts, and it highly, highly varies.
Yeah, and to get back to your area of expertise, It seems like that's actually another one of the benefits of Bitcoin, right? Like that, there is a trust but verify effect to it. Like if I remember right, you talking about how like you can track down the Bitcoin. You can know if this person who is buying something from you is trustworthy. Like you can
Mhm.
yeah. There's
Well, no, I can assume that person is untrustworthy. And the Bitcoin code itself performs that sort of mediation where I can assume that this person is trying to scam me. They send me some Bitcoins, and I can verify that the Bitcoins are real, that the Bitcoins are trustworthy, even if that person is a liar. And it honestly, takes the burden of trust from the individuals and puts it on the currency itself, in a completely decentralized fashion where I don't have to trust anyone to honor anything, just as long as the Bitcoins that are in my wallet are actually there and my node says that they're real. Then I can assume that everyone is out to get me and I'll still be okay.
Yeah, I mean that's great. Like that does take trust out of the equation on one side. Yeah, I mean there's still the trust of having to be like, is this person gonna send me what I just paid for? Which that goes beyond the capabilities of Bitcoin. That's
it's beyond the currency.
That's where the regulatory, voluntary regulatory bodies are going to come in. Like if this person has a good rating in whatever, yeah.
That's really the crazy thing, though, is that like eBay and Amazon have basically solved that. Like that, if you were to buy something, it would basically never happen that you would pay for it and it would never get sent to you.
Yeah, it was always a risk buying anything on the internet because it was like I remember once I ordered something from eBay and I had to go get a traveler's check just to make sure this person didn't scam me, And so that I still have those Trigun DVDs on my shelf that I bought with a traveler's check that I got from Come and Go. But yeah, I guess it's true. Like there is, but a lot of that guesswork has been taken out because of trustworthy mediators. And I know Amazon has other issues, as often happens when a corporation gets big enough where they can start buying politicians. But the reason it got big is because it did kind of, as a mediator, it took the issue of common language and even to some extent common currency out of it, like by being that mediator. And I don't have to trust the person I'm buying a product from. I trust Amazon.
Right. And you don't have to think about what currency the person, I mean, you can buy from Spain and you don't have to, you don't care. You buy in US dollars, that person gets their money, Amazon takes care of the rest.
Yeah. I mean, and that's where like, it always feels like we're zooming off topic, but it really does come back to the decentralizations. Is that even as the possibility of getting around the world has become more possible, this actually, contrary to what some may say, actually makes decentralization more possible. Like we don't have to form big trade agreements with multinational conglomerations. Like we can, through trusted mediators, we can just live in our own town. Like we don't have to like just decentralization is more possible now than it ever was because our need for someone to keep an eye on the overseas has gone down.
And that's really important now because I think rural life has seen the effects of centralization in a more negative ways than urban life has. But now, because of technology like that, I think rural life and small towns actually have more of a chance to recoup that. One example is just the ability to be anywhere, like you're talking about, and it doesn't matter where you are anymore, and that's inherently decentralizing.
And it really limits government's abilities to do anything coercive, because if I can make my money on a computer, which I'm aware there is a significant portion of the world's population that can't do that. But for the ones that can, I don't have to be in Iowa. I don't have to be in Florida. I don't have to be in the United States. I can be anywhere as long as I have the internet connection. And if the government that I am under is taxing me too heavily or has opinions that I don't like, I can just leave. And it's decentralizing, if you will, civil wars, where I am seceding, or perhaps I should say it's decentralizing secession, where I can secede as an individual and go find some other country that suits my needs, and ultimately, hopefully, will force governments to provide services, that are worth the cost that they charge. Because if they don't, people will go to where it is.
And like there's even like oh my gosh, like VPNs where I can secede from a country technically without even moving, right? I mean, there's a sense in which I could, my computer could be in Bulgaria while I'm sitting in Iowa. Like there's the and I think this is really where we are seeing kind of government starting to freak out about their inability to control us, because it's more and more impossible. Like the internet, when Al Gore invented the internet, he let something out of the box that he wasn't able to contain.
And you'll see the panic in the government more and more as they try to fight. Pretty much the core of any of this is encryption technology. They will try to make it evil, illegal, inaccessible, whatever it takes to make it so that they can watch the people. And VPNs are great, but those are run by companies. VPNs are actually centralized. And there are some VPNs that claim to be outside of the control of what's called the Five Eyes, the governments that have a surveillance agreements. It's, I believe, the U.S., Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. And they share data on their people with each other. And so they're VPNs based in Switzerland, VPNs based in the Cayman Islands or whatever. But even so, they are still centralized. All the information is running through their servers. And that is a point of failure. The problem with anything that's centralized is there is a point of failure. And given enough incentive, and it will always reach the point where the governments feel that they have the incentive, those central point of failures become the point of attack. They might survive, but because that becomes the point that the governments focus on. There are other ways of doing it. If you're familiar with Tor, that is it is a decentralized.
The dark net.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, if you want to access the dark net, you actually have to use Tor, or do other things that's way above my comprehension. So I just stick with Tor. But it's a decentralized way of anonymizing internet traffic, where your request to see that web page, whether it's legal or illegal, is encrypted, sent along anywhere 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different computers across the world. Nobody knows who's requesting it. Nobody knows where it's going. And it is functionally unseizable information. Once you're done, you close your browser window, it's gone. Nobody will ever find it. VPNs are good, but that's the centralized first step option. There's more. And the end point is that as governments crack down on encryption itself, centralized systems will begin to crumble, and will begin to have to bow to the new rules, or else the government will just shut them down. And the decentralized options, running encryption on your own computer and then just sending the encrypted text in a normal email, is much better than using a centralized encrypted email provider. Because then the only way to break that encryption is to steal your computer.
Did you read about
it's a lot harder.
the military encryption company that actually was like infiltrated by U.S. intelligence for decades and decades and decades, and they legitimately sold encryption technology to foreign countries under the guise that this was uncrackable.
Wow.
And I believe this was in the post-World War II era, and it was during the Soviet era, but the Soviets didn't trust this company. I forget which company in Europe it was, but the Soviets wouldn't buy from this company, but all these other countries, like the second world countries, were buying from them essentially, and the Western intelligence was able to, like, for decades they were able to read their messages.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise
which is
me.
why decentralization is so important for that. You need to understand your technology, and you need to be in control of it. Yeah, but like you were saying, encryption is the backbone for all of those decentralization enabling technologies, and that's one thing they're trying to take away. We've seen threats of using the Section 230 protections, taking those away if companies won't let them do what they want to do.
Yeah, and so at that point, the journalists or anybody are forced to make the choice between what's legal and what's right. Where if the protections, the legal protections, are taken away, the technology still exists. You know, if using encryption is illegal, encryption still exists, and it still can be done. And then people are forced to figure out where they stand on that issue. If you guys haven't read it yet, I highly recommend Edward Snowden's book, Permanent Record. Yeah,
I was meaning to look into that. Pretty good.
It's really humanizing, because all you know about this guy is he leaked NSA files and is now stuck in Russia. The government hates him because that's what governments do.
His interviews are really
that's
humanizing.
It's just he talks about his life. He talks about how he got into computers. He talks about, you know, how he got into contracting for the NSA. I mean, it just walks. It's just a narrative. It's just a biography, and it reads really well. It's easy. It's funny. And then the last 4 or 5 chapters just hit you like a ton of bricks, and you realize this guy was like 29 when he was doing it. He's my age. Here I am complaining about my job, working in aviation, and he's leaking government secrets for the public's good, and it's just really, you know, it puts things into perspective, both as a Christian and just as a human. But it's just fascinating, and then all of a sudden you're like, wow, I really care about this encryption stuff. I'm gonna go learn it, which is kind of what happened for me.
To kind of summarize everything we've been going through, you know, it's about, you know, big one size fits all never works. Like, there's just, individuals are different, areas are different, and the more we trust those standing over those big entities, the more power they get, the less trustworthy they become. We didn't even get into the issue of, I trust my mayor of a small town more than I trust any senator or whatever, because I know that mayor still has a business he needs to run, and he still needs to keep the townspeople on his side and keep them coming to his restaurant. But the bigger the powers get, and as you keep saying, the more centralizing it becomes, the scarier it becomes. The more power, like, you know, Lord Acton. He didn't write poetry. He talked about politics and economics. Lord Acton, you know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more power you get, the harder it is, or the easier it is to abuse that power. And as my friend who challenged me when the Patriot Act was first being passed, back when I was a W supporting red-blooded evangelical neocon, as he pointed out to me and challenged me way back when, well, it's fine as long as the nice guy's in control. What about the next guy? What if he's not as nice? Maybe you trust whatever party you support to be in control of this great power. They're not going to be in control forever.